Hello, I'm Zoe Glasson from the Australian Institute of International Affairs, National Office. I'm here today with Professor Rory Medcalf, former diplomat and journalist and current head of the National Security College at ANU. Thank you, Professor Medcalf, for taking the time to answer a few questions today.
Real pleasure.
Great, looking forward to it. So, to begin, you've previously remarked that parliamentarians have a low awareness of security issues and that the National Security College could offer guidance to parliamentarians and political staffers. First, what is an example of a security risk that is not given sufficient attention? And second, despite this low awareness, politicians seem to talk about national security all the time. What is it that they're basing their arguments on?
Good questions. Look, I think the issue here, and I've written about this in the correspondence to the latest quarterly essay, or the one before by James Brown, on why or how does Australia go to war. I think the issue here is it's not so much that politicians aren't aware that national security issues exist and don't necessarily pay attention to them, but the issue is that I think a lot of our parliamentarians have fairly, limited levels of knowledge and understanding around these issues. Now that's natural at one level because of course parliamentarians are dealing with lots and lots of issues, and of course for many parliamentarians there are a lot of other important issues than national security. That's fine. But I do think that this is one of those areas where everyone seems to think they have some sort of deep innate knowledge, whereas in fact it requires often a lot of sensitisation to other points of view, to specialised expert insight, often to classified information, which isn't easy to get if you're in the opposition or even if you're a parliamentarian in general. So what I've suggested is that we need to find ways to socialise as well as to educate parliamentarians about the complexities of a lot of the security issues that Australia is facing. Now that could take the form of briefings, it could take the form of courses, and it occurs to me that the short courses that we run here at the National Security College, which we run for officials, mostly officials and some private sector people, some of these courses could be quite easily adapted for parliamentarians, and in many cases they would benefit as much from the discussion, a truly frank discussion in a safe environment, and I don't necessarily call Parliament a safe environment because you don't always speak your mind as an individual. They would benefit from that just as much as the specialised expert knowledge that they might get in that safe space. Now some of the issues that I have in mind, I would say cyber security is one issue where frankly very few of us have any degree of expert knowledge, and it's a constantly changing landscape, and yet it affects us all, including it affects those parliamentarians whose email accounts may or may not have been hacked over the years. It's also an issue that affects the private sector, that affects all of Australian society. So I think that's one area where technical experts, policy experts could get together with parliamentarians and really talk them through why are we concerned about cyber security as a nation. Another example I would give is the role of, if you like, foreign involvement or foreign interference in Australia's domestic affairs with a security dimension. So the issues we've had around political donations in recent months, the famous Sam Dastyari affair, for example, issues around foreign influence, particularly Chinese influence through soft power, the security aspects of investment decisions, for example. There's clearly a need for a lot more in-depth, frank, specialised discussion on those issues so that parliamentarians can think and speak and act about them, act around those issues with confidence and with knowledge in the national interest.
You've just brought up the issue of Chinese political donations. How serious a problem do you think this is in the Australian government? Is it very widespread, and what might the security implications be?
Well, I think at one level it's a matter of perception, but that's half the problem. I mean, the fact is we know there are large sums of money, ultimately millions of dollars, that have been donated to Australian political parties by interests that are identified or associated with the People's Republic of China, with the Chinese Communist Party. Even if in some cases, the individuals were Australian nationals, or the individuals were Chinese nationals, or they were from entities, if you like, that spanned the border of Australia and China. So I think the issue is partly about perception, because the fact is that all the countries in Asia are watching each other at the moment around this question of Chinese involvement, interference in the affairs of others. I mean, I've been in Korea, Japan, a number of other countries recently where they're having the same conversations about this issue, and they're looking at Australia almost as an example of how to manage, I guess, domestic sovereignty in the face of Chinese wealth, Chinese power, and the influence of the Chinese Communist Party. The perception issue is such that even if parties don't actually change their policies on the basis of donations received, there's a perception there that they might, and that's in itself a cause for concern. The second issue relates more to, I guess, the rules that our political parties impose on themselves. A lot of other countries in the region to which we preach, Australia preaches good governance, good practice in governance, and really taking money out of politics, if you like, are countries that actually have stricter rules around political donations than we do. So pretty much all of the countries of Southeast Asia, in fact pretty much all of the countries of Asia, most countries in Asia have stricter rules around foreign political donations than Australia does. So in that sense, it weakens our ability to project influence and project the idea of a rules-based order on the region, and we ourselves are a little bit less than perfect in that regard.
Absolutely.
And then finally there's that question of on what basis is our political elite actually making the decisions that lead to our foreign policies, our defence policies, our choices about what to say on the South China Sea, our choices about whether to support the US alliance and so forth, and how far would this issue go? So I think there is a significant groundswell of opinion in Australia now, even among people whose political parties, political people whose parties have accepted donations in the past, to say that we need to do something to remove this perception problem from the Australian political debate. That's what I would say on that issue.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now on another issue that we were discussing, the second part of your question was around.
Yes, what are they basing their argument on, given their perhaps low awareness of some of these issues?
I wouldn't dare to presume or to generalise about that, and certainly there are some parliamentarians who do have good awareness of security issues. I should have mentioned that at the outset. There are plenty of fine examples or exceptions to the rule, but I think as a rule, most of our parliamentarians have had very little to do with national security or the defence force or those aspects of the national interest in their careers prior to entering Parliament. Now that doesn't stop parliamentarians having opinions, whether they're reflecting what they see to be community views or whether they're reflecting their own views, or even in some cases reflecting the official briefings that they've had. And sometimes the official briefings aren't always the most expert briefings that they can get. So I think in the national interest in a relatively small country like Australia, where we only have, I guess, a limited pool of knowledge and talent, I think there's absolutely no harm in making sure our parliamentarians have the best possible briefings right across the political spectrum on security.
Absolutely. There is potential for growth in Australia's security partnerships in our region, for example with India, Japan and Indonesia. How could this be represented in the foreign policy white paper that was announced by Foreign Minister Bishop in August, and why is it potentially dangerous for Australia to build a closer relationship with Japan, for example?
It's a complex question, and I probably will come back to the last part of it, which I think is I guess, makes an assumption that I probably would disagree with. That's fine. It's great that we now have an announcement for a formal document like a Foreign Affairs white paper. In many ways, Australia's already made some significant achievements in its defence policy with, for example, the Defence White Paper this year, putting long-term definitions of our interests, the capabilities we need, the partnerships we want, and the budget to go with them. So I think the defence part of the puzzle is reasonably well looked after for the moment. But of course, defence is part of a much wider set of policy responses to a changing global and regional security environment. And of course, there is a major foreign policy element to that. So to have a foreign policy white paper that is effective, we need to, I guess, salvage some of what was good out of the Asian Century White Paper a few years ago under the Gillard government, which I think correctly looked at our region as having great prominence in Australia's interests and challenges into the future. looked at economic opportunities, but looked perhaps too heavily at economic opportunities without emphasising sufficiently the security risks and the security challenges that a rising Asia poses. One thing to be avoided in a foreign affairs white paper also, I think, is really stark partisanship. And I think there was a little bit too much partisanship in the Asian Century white paper, and there was certainly too much partisanship in the way the government subsequently almost exiled that white paper from the history books because it was, of course, a Labor document that a coalition government essentially tried to erase. So we need a foreign affairs white paper that will stand the test of time. I think we need a foreign affairs white paper that connects the domestic with the international dimension. So it connects economics with security. It has a place for defence, but it's not only about defence, but it also acknowledges that foreign policy is changing. It's no longer just what diplomats do. It engages the whole of society, engages the private sector, engages pretty much all arms of government. So a joined up international whole of nation response to foreign policy challenges, a link with the defence side of things, a context, if you like, for embedding defence policy, and a continued focus on the Asian or the Indo-Pacific region, plus a bold lack of partisanship. I'd say they're the four elements to a successful foreign affairs white paper. But to go back to the core of your question about Australia building security partnerships with countries in the region that are not the United States and not China, because I think that is the clear factor that distinguishes India, Japan, Indonesia, a number of the other countries that we've thought about in that regard. What's striking is that in the past 10 years or so, we've seen a real trend in Asia towards countries that have traditionally been American allies or partners. Australia and Japan are examples of that, beginning to do more together. So in a sense, if you think of Asia as a hub and spokes network with the United States as the hub and all of the allies and partners as the spokes of the wheel radiating out from that hub, the spokes are beginning to join up. The web is connecting up, and in a way we're working with one another regardless of what the United States is doing. And I think that's a good thing intrinsically, because there's no reason why countries with common challenges and common interests shouldn't be communicating and cooperating on security issues. And one of the distorting effects of the US alliance system over the years was that it did reduce the incentive or the ability for countries like Australia and Japan, or Australia and Indonesia, or Australia and India, or India and Japan, you get that picture, to talk to one another or to work with one another on security challenges. Now that's changing, we're starting to do that. Part of the context for that is of course the rise of China and the fact that we now have a power in Asia that looks like it has the potential to be a dominant force, perhaps to overbalance all of the others almost combined. And therefore one of the, I think, understandable tendencies of other countries is to look for security in scale, to look for security in numbers, to do more things together. So we were discussing just now whether Australia getting too close to Japan as one of these Asian security partners is a good thing or potentially even a dangerous thing. And I think there's some risk in thinking about the question that way, because it's naturally in China's interest as a rising power and a power that has all sorts of unresolved historical differences and disputes with Japan to create the impression that Japan continues to be a big part of the regional security problem. I think on most issues, Japan is not only not part of the problem, but in fact has been a really, I think, commendable international security player and partner in recent years and decades. So its adherence to a rules-based regional order, the limits on its military spending, the limits constitutionally on the way it can use and deploy force, and generally the moderation of its political debate on most issues. Now, of course, the one remaining problem, I think, in Japan's regional security engagement is the conflicted view internally within Japan about history, around the history of the Second World War, or the history of the brutality of the Japanese Imperial Army during that conflict. And that is obviously a major vulnerability in Japan's ability to engage with others in the region. And as a friend of Japan, we need to help Japan to help itself on that issue. But on all of the contemporary strategic issues, I think Australia's and Japan's interests are quite closely aligned. And I guess if as a region we're going to somehow limit the challenge to the rules-based order that Chinese power brings with it, and that the way we see Chinese power in the South China Sea being manifest, then smaller and middle-sized countries, democracies and so forth, need to find ways to coordinate and work together. And so in that context, the Australia-Japan relationship is in fact, I think, good for regional stability and security, and we need more of it, not less.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you once again for your time, Professor Medcalf. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you very much.
And for more information on the Australian Institute of International Affairs, please visit our website at www.internationalaffairs.org.au. Thank you.